Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Lorena Gallo was born on October 31st, 1969 in Venezuela. She grew up in an environment where her family struggled with financial difficulties. From a young age, she knew she had to work to ensure a better life for her family. She believed that the United States could offer her a better future. With this dream, she immigrated to the U.S. at a young age and began working as a manicurist in the state of Virginia. Her beauty and humble personality drew the attention of those around her. In 1988, Lorena met John Wayne Bobbitt, a handsome and charismatic Marine, at a party near a military base. John stood out with his muscular body and confident demeanor. From the moment they met, Lorena was captivated by his smile and the sparkle in his eyes. John, in turn, found Lorena's exotic beauty and shy yet affectionate demeanor attractive. In their first meetings, John acted like a very kind and romantic man. He brought Lorena flowers and spoke to her with loving words. Lorena felt safe with him. John could be a part of the American dream she had imagined. For Lorena, who came from a poor background, marrying a strong and confident American soldier seemed like an opportunity that could change her life. Soon, they fell deeply in love. John promised Lorena that they would have a wonderful life together. He took her to luxurious restaurants, telling her they would build a happy future. Lorena wanted to establish a permanent life in America, and John could offer her this opportunity. Just a year later, in 1989, they got married. Their wedding was simple but full of happiness. Lorena, in her white wedding dress, thought her dreams were coming true. She believed she had found the love of her life. However, shortly after getting married, everything began to change. John started transforming into a different person even in the first few months of their marriage. What started as small arguments soon turned into larger fights. John began drinking alcohol more frequently and started acting increasingly cold toward Lorena. Lorena couldn't understand her husband's indifferent behavior. At first, she thought he was stressed due to his job. She tried harder to make him happy and worked to ensure that everything at home was perfect. But John's indifference only grew over time. He no longer embraced her with love, nor did he speak romantic words. Sometimes, he would disappear for hours. Lorena began to feel that this situation was not normal. As their marriage progressed, John's bad qualities became more apparent. His alcohol consumption had increased, and when he drank, he would turn into an angry person. Initially, his aggression was only verbal. He would yell at Lorena, belittle her, and insult her. But over time, these verbal assaults escalated into physical violence. Lorena would never forget the first time her husband hit her. During a small argument, John suddenly got angry and pushed her, causing her to crash into a wall. Lorena started crying from the shock, but John didn't care. As time went on, John became more and more merciless toward Lorena. When he drank, he completely lost control, sometimes beating Lorena for no reason. Lorena couldn't tell anyone about the physical and emotional abuse she was experiencing. She was a woman alone in America, far from her family. According to her cultural values, she thought that even if there were problems in marriage, a woman had to endure them. But deep inside, she knew that this situation couldn't continue forever. As their marriage continued, John's infidelity also started to surface. When Lorena realized that her husband was cheating on her, her disappointment reached an indescribable level. She had sacrificed everything for him and remained loyal to him. But John was spending time with other women, returning home in the early hours of the morning and answering Lorena's questions angrily. She began to feel that this marriage had turned into a prison rather than a loving relationship. John had shattered her dreams. Lorena had entered this relationship with the hope of a loving marriage, but now she was trapped in physical and emotional pain. On one hand, she still had some feelings for him. Maybe things would get better. Maybe they would return to their happy days. But over time, she realized that John would never change. Lorena now found herself stuck in a cycle with no way out. Her husband's violence, insults, and infidelity grew worse with each passing day. The anger and frustration that had been building up inside her were beginning to become uncontrollable. Although she wasn't aware of it yet, these feelings would soon lead to a horrific event in the coming days. Thus, Lorena Bobbitt's story, which had started as a simple love story, was slowly turning into a tragedy. The helplessness and anger growing inside her would eventually erupt, leading to an incident that would become the talk of the world. At the beginning of her marriage, Lorena had tried to hold on to the hope that John would change and their marriage would improve. But as the days, weeks, and months passed, she began to realize that she couldn't escape the hell she was living in. John, who had initially only yelled at her when he was angry and used demeaning words, eventually turned those insults into physical violence. When she received the first slap, she cried, thinking that John would come and apologize the next day. But the apology never came. Instead, there was more violence and more tears. John had begun drinking more and more. Every night he went out drinking for hours and returning home drunk. Sometimes he was angry, sometimes indifferent. Lorena had started paying attention to his every move because she couldn't predict when he would snap. When he came home drunk, he could lash out over the smallest thing. Sometimes he would complain about the food being too salty. Other times he would shout at her for having the television volume too high. Lorena became increasingly fearful, choosing her actions carefully. Her marriage had turned into a tunnel of fear. When she woke up in the morning, she wondered if she would face violence that day or just insults. With each passing day, she noticed that John was becoming more and more brutal. The days when he had touched her with love were long gone. Now he only approached her with anger, acting as if her very existence irritated him. Lorena felt her husband was becoming more and more of a stranger. As if all this violence and suffering wasn't enough, she realized that John had begun being with other women. Unknown numbers on the phone bills, late-night disappearances, the scent of perfume on him. Everything screamed of John's infidelity. But what hurt Lorena the most was that John didn't even bother to hide it. Sometimes he would come home with notes from other women, looking into Lorena's eyes and sarcastically saying, "What will you do? Are you going to leave me?" Lorena thought about leaving. But it wasn't that easy. Her family was far away. She was alone in America, a stranger. There was no one around to offer her support. Moreover, she knew it was nearly impossible to escape from John's control. John thought she was dependent on him and therefore would never let her go. Every attempt to leave resulted in more violence for Lorena. Over time, Lorena's mental state began to change. Once a cheerful dreamer of a woman, she had now turned into a withdrawn, fearful person. Even when going to work, she couldn't look people in the eye. She wore long-sleeved blouses to hide the bruises on her arms, and made up excuses so no one would ask her what had happened. But there was one thing she couldn't hide in her eyes: hopelessness. One day, John came home late again. He was drunk. Without caring whether Lorena was asleep or not, he turned on the lights in the bedroom. He could see that she was disturbed, but he didn't care. He went to the kitchen for a beer. Then, he came to her and began speaking in a cold tone. "You're lucky to have me," he said, laughing. "What would you do without me, huh?" Lorena didn't say anything. She knew that staying silent was safer now. But John didn't like silence. He became angry for not getting a response and suddenly threw the beer can to the floor. The sound of the glass bottle shattering made Lorena's heart race. "You're not talking to me anymore, are you?" John said, stepping closer. "Do you think you're better than me?" Inside Lorena, the anger she had been suppressing for years was rising. But that anger was mixed with a despair born from fear. She had imagined that one day all of this would end, but how? She couldn't escape. There was only one option left: endure. But that night something changed for Lorena. After the incident, when she went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself. The bruises under her eyes, the exhaustion on her face, and the deep sadness. Once a happy woman, Lorena was now completely gone. She asked herself, "This can't go on. When will it end?" Something inside her was breaking. For the first time in a long while, Lorena felt the anger building up inside her like a violent storm. The life under John's control had become unsustainable, but she thought there was nothing she could do to change it, until fate unexpectedly led her down a new path. This was the time when Lorena had to face the harsh reality. The night spent in fear and helplessness continued to grow the storm inside her. She didn't know when it would erupt, but one day she felt everything would change. And that day was closer than she thought. Lorena's life was increasingly turning into a nightmare. As days passed, John's violence escalated and his alcohol consumption became uncontrollable. Every evening he returned home drunk and attacked her over trivial reasons. Lorena had started to predict his moods. She could even tell whether a fight would break out that night, just by how John opened the door. If he opened it quickly and harshly, it was certain that something would go wrong that night. Sometimes John not only showed physical violence, but also acted as if he were torturing her. He used psychological methods to hurt her, humiliating and belittling her, telling her she was a failure as a woman. "You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for me," he would shout at her face. Lorena sometimes realized that she was beginning to believe John's words. Years of pressure and fear had destroyed her sense of self. She was no longer an individual, but just a shadow controlled by John. But every person has a limit to what they can endure. Lorena had been walking along the edge of that limit for a long time, and one night, everything finally changed. June 23rd, 1993. That day began like any other. Lorena went to work and tended to her clients at the nail salon, but the unease inside her that day was greater than usual. She had a strange feeling that something bad was going to happen. When she returned home, in the evening, John hadn't come back yet. Lorena, as usual, carefully locked the door and entered. She turned on the TV, trying to distract herself, but her mind was constantly on John. When would he come home? What mood would he be in? She couldn't predict anything about the night ahead. As midnight approached, John suddenly entered, opening the door with a loud bang. He was drunk. He smelled like another woman's perfume and wore his usual mocking grin. Lorena took a deep breath. She knew that saying or doing anything at that moment was dangerous. She had to stay silent. But John didn't tolerate the silence. "I asked you something," he shouted. "Why aren't you answering me?" Lorena lowered her head. The anger that had built up inside her mixed with fear. John's every move now felt unbearable. When his hands grabbed her, Lorena wanted to scream, but no sound came out. That night, John not only insulted and belittled her, but he also used his most brutal power, just as he had done countless times before. As Lorena looked at the ceiling, with tears streaming from her eyes, she knew the breaking inside her was beyond repair. That night would be a turning point for her. As John's breath hit her face, something in Lorena's mind snapped. The fear, helplessness, and anger she had carried for years all combined into an explosive force. When John fell asleep a few minutes later, Lorena got out of bed. Her legs were shaking, but her mind was clearer than ever. She went to the kitchen, her eyes locked on the knife on the counter. When she picked it up, it was as if the entire house had gone silent. The fear she had felt for years was now replaced by something else. There was an unfamiliar calmness inside her. She walked slowly back to the bedroom. John was deeply asleep. The alcohol had knocked him out. Lorena hesitated for a few seconds. Thousands of thoughts raced through her mind, but one stood out. It was time to end this. A moment later, the knife touched John's body. A scream shattered the night's silence. But for the first time, Lorena felt free. And so, she put an end to the torture that had lasted for years. That night, an event occurred that would go down in history. Lorena Bobbitt was no longer just a woman who had suffered from abuse. She had become a woman who wrote her own story. But this story was far from over. After that night, everything would become even more complicated. When Lorena Bobbitt dropped the knife on the floor, her body was trembling. The adrenaline had caused her breath to quicken, and her heartbeat echoed in her ears. Her eyes were fixed on John, writhing in his own blood. John was screaming in pain, but Lorena's mind no longer processed his cries. It was an explosion of the anger she had suppressed for years, and she only began to fully comprehend what she had done a few seconds later. The sharp edge of the knife had not only severed John's body, but also broken the chains of fear that had bound Lorena inside. For the first time, she felt strong. A feeling grew inside her. She could escape the hell she had been trapped in for years. But at the same time, panic took hold. What should she do now? She froze for a few seconds. Then, she did the first thing that came to her mind. She had to run. Lorena quickly left the bedroom. Her legs could barely support her. Her body was still in shock from what had just happened. She went to the kitchen, dropped the knife into the sink, grabbed her keys, and rushed outside. The moonlight illuminated the dark street. Everything felt surreal. As she got into her car, her hands were shaking. While trying to start the engine, she dropped the key several times. Finally, she managed to start the car and drove off quickly. But she had no idea where to go. Her mind was almost completely shut down due to the shock and panic attack. She drove for some time without awareness. Her heart was beating so fast that it was difficult for her to breathe. John's screams echoed in her mind. But there was a strange feeling inside her. Freedom. When Lorena finally came to her senses, she decided to go to a friend's house. That night, she felt like this was the only person she could trust. When she knocked on her friend's door, her eyes were bloodshot, and she was gasping for air. As the door opened, she immediately started to cry. "What happened, Lorena?" her friend asked, pulling her inside. Lorena struggled to find the words, but her throat was tight. She sat shaking for a few minutes. Finally, through her tears, she began to explain what had happened. Her friend couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What are we going to do?" she asked. But Lorena's mind was still in a haze. She only knew one thing. The police would find her soon. Meanwhile, John Bobbitt's screams had woken up the neighbors. John, writhing in bed, was moaning in pain. A neighbor immediately called the police and ambulance. The medical team, upon arriving at the scene, was shocked by John's condition. Immediate intervention was required. The police tried to get a statement from John, but he was only able to mutter in a hoarse voice, "My wife did it. She did it." An operation was quickly launched to find Lorena. Places she might have gone were investigated, and eventually her location at her friend's house was discovered. The police rushed there. When they opened the door, Lorena was still sitting on the couch, staring blankly. She barely reacted when the police arrested her. It was as if her mind was somewhere else. As they handcuffed her, the only thing on her mind was, what would happen now? When Lorena was taken to the station, the shock of the incident still hadn't worn off. The police were asking her questions, but she just stared blankly ahead. She knew what she had done, but she hadn't fully grasped the consequences. Meanwhile, John, who had been rushed to the hospital, was in critical condition. However, after a lengthy surgery, the doctors managed to save him. But when the story leaked to the press, the entire world became captivated by this crazy tale. Newspapers, television, and radio all reported the same story the next day. A woman had taken revenge on her husband after years of abuse. Some saw Lorena as a feminist hero, while others accused her of being a criminal. But one thing was certain. The event had captured the world's attention, and there was no turning back. As Lorena awaited trial in custody, she knew that her life would never be the same again. But that night she had realized one thing. She had finally escaped the hell she had lived in for years. However, this escape would bring a new battle. As Lorena Bobbitt awaited her trial in her cell, she knew that her life would never be the same. The consequences of that night were now in front of her. The shock of the event still hadn't left her body, but her mind was gradually starting to come back. She couldn't help but ask herself the question, did I really do this? But the answer was clear. She had taken the knife in her hand and ended years of pain and helplessness in one moment. Now, though, she faced a completely different battle, a fight for her life under the scrutiny of the court and the media. When the details of John Bobbitt's ordeal leaked to the press, the entire country became fixated on the unbelievable story. News outlets continuously covered it with front-page headlines like, "Horrific Revenge," "A Woman's Vengeance," "Shocking Incident," "Man Attacked by His Wife," splashed across newspapers. For the media, this was pure sensationalism. People were divided. One group saw Lorena as a wild and merciless attacker, while others argued that she was a woman who had suffered years of abuse and was simply trying to defend herself. Women's rights advocates rallied around Lorena. They wanted to make her a symbol. "She has become the voice of the women who have been silent for years," they proclaimed. On the other hand, men's rights advocates argued that John was the victim, that no form of violence could ever be justified, regardless of the circumstances. The trial would become one of the most talked-about cases in U.S. history. When John Bobbitt was admitted to the hospital, doctors noted that his condition was critical. However, the medical world would soon call him a miracle. Through a lengthy surgery, doctors managed to reattach the severed organ, a surgical success, but John's life would never be the same again. While he lay in the hospital room, journalists waited outside. Everyone was eager to hear what he had to say. A few weeks later, when he finally appeared before the cameras, his eyes were still filled with shock and rage. "I'm a victim," he said in a cold tone. "No one deserves something like this." John's portrayal of himself as a victim only fueled the public debate, but no one was talking about the years of violence he had inflicted on Lorena. At least not at that time. When Lorena was brought to court, her lawyers were preparing her defense. Their strongest argument was the years of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse she had endured. As the trial began, Lorena's attorneys described the trauma she had suffered to the jury. Lorena's eyes welled up with tears, but she tried to stay strong. It was difficult to put the horrors she had endured into words. But at some point, everything spilled out. "I'm not a monster. I was just someone lost in years of suffering, fear, and pain. That night, I lost myself." John's attorneys, however, tried to paint Lorena as a cold-blooded criminal. To them, this wasn't an act of self-defense, it was a premeditated act of vengeance. The prosecutor argued that Lorena was violent and mentally unstable. But her lawyers countered that she had been under severe pressure for years and had suffered profound trauma. During the trial, evaluations of Lorena's mental health were conducted. Psychologists confirmed that she was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Additionally, evidence began to surface supporting Lorena's testimony. Medical records from previous visits, statements from neighbors, and testimonies from some of her friends all confirmed the abuse she had endured. As the trial revealed the extent of Lorena's suffering, public opinion began to shift. Those who had initially viewed her as a monster started to understand what she had gone through. Meanwhile, the media went into a frenzy. Every day, television channels covered the case from different angles. Talk shows, news broadcasts, columnists, all had their take on the incident. People gathered outside the courthouse holding signs and shouting. Some were supporting Lorena, while others stood by John's side. Lorena Bobbitt's story had caused many women to recall their own sufferings. Her case was raising significant awareness about domestic violence. Finally, the big day arrived. The court was about to announce its decision. Lorena sat in the courtroom holding her breath as the jury had made their deliberations. The judge broke the silence and announced the verdict. Defendant Lorena Bobbitt is found to be legally insane and therefore not criminally responsible. The defendant will not serve a prison sentence, but will undergo psychiatric treatment. Lorena broke down in tears at that moment. After years of abuse, at least she knew she wouldn't rot away in prison. But was this a victory for her? She would live the rest of her life in the shadow of that night. When the verdict was announced, public reactions were mixed. Some believed justice had been served, while others still believed Lorena was guilty. But the truth was that what happened that night was not just about two individuals. It sparked a worldwide conversation about the violence women endure and the silent suffering they face. Lorena Bobbitt's case went down in history, but her life was still ongoing. Now she had to face a whole new reality. Did freedom truly mean being free? She would spend the rest of her life seeking an answer to that question. As Lorena left the courtroom, hundreds of camera lenses were trained on her. Journalists, lawyers, curious bystanders, everyone was watching her. For her, gaining her freedom meant not rotting behind iron bars, but was she truly free? Although the court decision declared her innocent, with psychiatric treatment as the only condition, it was clear that the world now saw her as the woman who cut off her husband's genitals. Her name had become headline news, discussed for days, on television, and she had become a symbol for abused women. But at the same time, some viewed her as a criminal. In this new life, she had no idea who she was or where she was going. Following the court decision, Lorena had to stay in a psychiatric facility for evaluation. The cold walls of the hospital offered her a chance to confront her past. During her therapy sessions, she began to open up about the trauma she had endured over the years. "I was afraid," she said through tears. "Every day, every night, I never knew what he would do. I normalized him beating me, forcing himself on me, humiliating me. But that night I realized I just couldn't take it anymore." Doctors diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, confirming that she had been under immense psychological pressure for years and had experienced a major breakdown. However, Lorena's true battle was not just in her mind. It continued in the outside world as well. After leaving the hospital, Lorena wanted to leave her past behind and live a normal life. But no matter where she went or what she tried to do, the media wouldn't leave her alone. Every day, reporters stood at her door, and television networks continuously brought up her life. People on the street looked at her. Some supported her, while others walked by, sneering. Men, in particular, became tense when they saw her. Some made sarcastic comments, while others gave her threatening looks. But the biggest shock came one day when she turned on the television. John Bobbitt was giving an interview. After Lorena's release from court without being sentenced, John began presenting himself as a victim to the public. At first he was quiet, but soon, noticing the media attention, he began to see himself as a star. "My life is ruined," he said in front of the cameras. "I was just a man who loved his wife, but she took away my manhood. Who would have guessed a woman could do this?" John started to appear on television shows, portraying himself as a victim. People felt sorry for him, especially some male groups who saw him as a hero. However, over time it became clear that John's true motives were different. He started finding ways to profit from the media attention. He was looking for ways to make money from the scandalous events. Eventually, John entered the adult film industry to prove his comeback, even making scandalous remarks like, "My manhood works better than ever." When Lorena saw these on television, she couldn't believe her eyes. She thought he was suffering, but he was using this tragedy as a gateway to fame. This became a turning point for Lorena. She would no longer remain silent. After years of playing the role of a victim, Lorena decided it was time to stand up. She needed to tell her side of the story. For so long it was only John's voice that echoed in the media, but now it was her turn. Women's rights activists and victims of domestic violence began to rally behind her. She was no longer just a news story. She would be a voice for the women who suffered the same abuse. She started giving interviews. People began focusing not only on what she went through that one night, but on the years of suffering she had endured. Lorena's story had become a symbol for the women's movement. As John's popularity faded, his decline began. His adult films failed, and his financial situation worsened. In the end, fame had brought him nothing. But Lorena found a new purpose in life. She had been silent for so long, but now she was speaking out. She started working with organizations that supported women experiencing domestic violence. She gave speeches and organized campaigns. The trauma of that night had once been her worst nightmare, but now she had turned it into a weapon for justice, becoming a figure fighting for women's rights. Over time, she rebuilt her life. She entered a new relationship and had children. Most importantly, she learned to free herself from the burden of her past. Lorena Bobbitt's story wasn't just the tragedy of one woman. It became the voice of millions and sparked a massive awareness about domestic violence. Years later, in an interview, she was asked, "Would you want to change that night?" Lorena paused, her eyes gazing far away. Then she smiled slightly and answered, "That night helped me escape the hell I was living. I wish it never had to come to that, but sometimes you have to go through the darkest places to find your way out. If I'm here today, it's because of that night. And I'm not just the victim of the past anymore. I am a warrior of today, and thus what started as a scandal became the symbol of a woman's rebirth."